Welcome to Wednesday morning into Unit 5. This morning we're going to talk about postmodern thought. So the process is going to be slightly different today because postmodern thought is so difficult that it's mostly going to be instructor-led. So it's mostly going to be a video that you watch if you have time and if you have the desire, because not everyone is going to be fascinated by postmodern thought. You can explore further, and I'm going to give you some leads into exploring further and some resources. But really, I would be very satisfied if you just watched the video and walked away thinking you have the essence of what postmodern thought is, and that you are going to work with that. It's probably the most complex of the theoretical paradigms. It is one that is fairly hard to get into for various reasons. And it's one that will probably take you. It'll probably take you on a lifelong journey. You will keep coming back to postmodern thought and uncover a little bit of it more every time you look at it. The reasons why it's most difficult is you will see that it originates from France mostly. So a lot of the original texts within postmodern thought are written in French, which has a very different. I'm French, so I'll tell you this from an insider perspective. Has a very different relationship to language. So language is very flowery, very long, uses a lot of jargon, very conceptual. And then when that's translated into English, it's really hard to penetrate. It's already hard to penetrate in French, but when it's translated into English, it really does become, there's a cultural shock there. It's not easy reading in English. And secondly, it's a complicated model, right? It's a model that you'll see asks you to do a lot of juggling and some fairly deep reflective process of deconstruction. And so people are not always very comfortable with it. So it is a long journey, but you will see that it's very useful. And you keep coming back to postmodern thought during your life. And particularly in current events, not so much for me in research, but in current events where you look around you in certain debates where you see postmodern thought in action and you realize, okay, this is why people are having these debates, because they're actually positioning themselves from this theoretical position. And that's where they come from. And we'll give you lots of examples of that, and I'll do it in self-standing, not to overcrowd you now, but in the afternoon I'll do it in self-standing slide with a couple of examples of what it looks like. Or we might come back to it on Friday morning when we look at, that's probably what I'll do. I'll tackle it on Friday morning when we look at the relationships of the theories together and how comfortable people are in working across theoretical fields. So it'll be the best time to show some practical example, particularly between critical theory and postmodern thought, and a lot of current debates that you see around you being articulated around these two. So we'll tackle it on Friday morning. So as I said, it's going to be more instructor-led. Quite happy for you to watch the video and then wrap it up and then focus on your presentations if you wish for Wednesday morning. If there are any remaining questions on assignment 4 by this stage, do contact me. So we're not going to do this obviously in the forum, but you can do this individually. We would be good now that we're on Wednesday to finalize the presentations for tomorrow and for Friday, and also to help you with any remaining questions that you have. So contact me if that's not been the case already. I will also in the forum engage with some of the news items. I think there are 2 in the section. I will do that in the forums directly. But the main objectives for today are postmodern thought, what is it? And also looking as each time the repercussions on research design methodologies as well. Okay, postmodernism, here we go. Start this journey. I'm going to talk to the slide rather than read the slide and use this to really explain to you the historical journey into postmodern thought. And hopefully if you get this, it's something I've done in class very often, you will be able to get into postmodern thoughts, at least a little bit, put a toe in and understand enough to be able to navigate. So Barthes is a really important thinker within the postmodern movement, and it's good to go back to Barthes and to his work to see the evolution of postmodern thought and go back to its origin and understand its basis. So a lot of the people who work in postmodern thought have been linguists, and particularly semiotics, which is a branch of linguists, of the linguist movement, or linguistics. And they were very active in France in the 1950s after the Second World War. So there's a lot of activity around postmodernism in France around that time, 50s and 60s. So Barthes is a linguist and has detailed this process of reflection from semiotics to postmodern thought. And it's a good way to sort of understanding the key features in a nutshell. Linguists, and particularly semiotics, around the 50s have started arguing that the representation of language was too simple and particularly a field called communication studies has picked these notions up and carried them until now. So now that's what the field of communication studies focuses on a lot. So they started contesting simplistic views of language, and arguing for a more complex interpretation of what language is. Up till then, we had this sort of pseudo belief that you had a word and an object, and that really word were equivalent to an object that they described, and that's how language worked. Semiotics and the other linguistic movements around the 50s started arguing that obviously this was a lot more complex than that, and that they started talking in terms of signifier and signified. And this is a distinction that has been carried over into communication studies, if you're interested in communication studies. So if you look at the signifier and the signified, you still have this notion at the beginning that a signifier, the word chair, is equivalent to the object chair. And that's how we function, that our brain sort of uses signifier to indicate the signified. Semiotics and that linguistic movement argues that it's a reductionist view, and that it's much more complicated than that. And the best way to explain to you what they're trying to do is to explain to you how, or to take you back to how we teach language to kids. If you have a baby and you're teaching them a language, you will point to the object. So you point to the signified, point to the object, and you repeat the signified chair, chair, chair. And by mimetism, the child eventually understands that that is associated with the signifier chair. But that's not it. And it goes beyond that, because very quickly, if you take your kid to the doctor's appointment, in the waiting room, there will be a chair there that may be entirely different than the chair you have at home. It's not a baby chair. It's not one of your living room chair. It's a chair, that's there and that maybe is designed differently. Doesn't have the same kind of back. Maybe it has armrests. Maybe it's a stool. And the child is still able quickly to associate the fact that the signifier applies to a signified which is slightly different, but still works. And therefore, you start understanding the notion that the signifier is not a direct correspondent or in direct correlation to the signified, but instead it has its own existence, and that in fact it represents a category, a conceptual category, rather than an object. And this is what enables the child to take the signifier, which you've given them, and to then look around and say, and think that is a chair. It's still a chair. It doesn't look like my chair, but it's still a chair because it serves the same purpose. It has 4 feet. I pretty much do the same thing with it. So I'm going to classify that within that word, within the signifier, as chair. So you see how we do this from very early on in infancy as we teach children language. And if you understand that notion, you quickly can make the jump that then Rollabout encourages you to do. He says that once in semiotics you've taken that step, and you understand that the signifier is much wider than the signified, that the signifier is a concept, and that the signifier carries connotations and symbols, it leads you into the understanding of postmodern thought. So Barth from there on says we have to push this analysis further and look at all the connotations and all the symbols that the signifier carries independently of the signified, independently of the object that or that it represents. He then takes the example of, in his book called Myth or Mythologies, I can't remember if this one is in French and the other in English, but it's basically called Myth. He talks about an example that will really help you, and I come back to this example all the time. He gives the example of you going to a dinner party in France, so he's French, he talks about Paris, you go to a dinner party and you bring a bottle of red wine. He argues that the signifier, bottle of red wine, as a term, doesn't just include a glass container with fermented grape juice. He says that the connotation, the inherent connotation, the values that are now associated with the signifier are so potent that when you walk into a room, it's not a glass bottle with container that you give, it is a symbol. It's a symbol of luxury, of an understanding of a code, of belonging to a group, of showing that you have a certain etiquette that corresponds with the etiquette of people that are receiving you. And therefore, he says that now the signifier becomes in itself a symbol which is sufficient to start allowing people to understand who belongs and who doesn't belong. And for him, in the discourse that Roland Barthes and a lot of the early postmodern use, he's focused on what he calls bourgeoisie, so the middle class. And he says actually the signifier, your bottle of wine, red wine, is an entrance key into the middle class. It's a recognition that you belong into that group. So you see how he's moving slowly and saying actually that signifying itself carries connotations, carry symbols, and those symbols actually have power in society. Your understanding of their connotation gives you access to certain things, and it gives you access to belonging into certain groups and affiliation to certain groups. So I've taken you there in a nutshell towards postmodern thought, and really that's all you need to do to know, and that's all you need to understand. They now go beyond that, and they said that these connotations and these symbols that are carried by the signifier, carried by these words, are so powerful that they become cultural representations. They become the way we see the world. They say that we don't see the world the way it is, we see the world through these symbolizers that the discourse, that our discourse carries. And they argue that the signifiers in themselves are so powerful that they hide reality and offer you a different reality. And as you've just seen with the example of the middle class, they say that that reality is a reality that the hegemonic group, hegemonic just means the group in power, the hegemonic group, the group in power has, and it's a key into belonging to them. The hegemonic group, through your understanding of these connotations, allows you in or rejects you. Okay, so it becomes a key to power dynamics within society, particularly in terms of allowing you into the power of the majority group or rejecting you from the majority group. And postmoderns argue that it's the hegemonic group, it's the majority group that really has control over the symbolism that is carried by the signifier, carried by these words, carried by these cultural representations. So the process of postmodern thinkers is to say, if you look at discourse, if you look at the language that we use, there are these words that are in themselves cultural representations. We have to deconstruct them. We have to demolish them because they hide reality from us. They offer us an alternate reality, which is the reality that the majority group wants us to buy into. And if we want to see the world as it really is, we have to deconstruct these and go towards something more authentic. Postmodern thinkers are going to argue that this is a never-ending process because once you've done that, you're getting to more clarity, more transparency, a better understanding of the world. But they argue that the hegemonic group is going to continue generating cultural representations through language that, again, are going to hide reality and instead substitutes to it a reality that suits the hegemonic group. And so they argue that that's a process that postmoderns have to carry on doing continuously. It's a non-ending process of critiquing because these symbols are recreated as soon as you demolish them. But it's still worthwhile because at least you are remaining lucid and really seeing the world as it is, not as it's pretended to be. So I hope that's enough to understand. I always come back to this example because it's fairly easy to understand, and students then understand it and then see the connections and the wider objectives of postmodern thought. Foucault, I'll give you another example. He is again a French writer from same period, died of AIDS. He was gay, but he himself attacks sort of a representation discourse. And one of the big ones, he does this with many aspects of society. But one he does, which seems strange, because he attacks the gay liberation movement and says, for example, in the discourse that we have in our democracies, we talk about the gay liberation, and he says we assume that before gay liberation there's a gay oppression. He says that's actually, he argues that that is actually a cultural representation. It's the hegemonic group again creating a cultural representation through language that doesn't exist because it fits its purpose. And he argues that really there has been, gay identity through the middle class and the Victorian days forever, but that the use of the word oppression and liberation allows it to actually distinguish itself from people it does not want to access into its actual composition. So they're saying that really LGBTQ issues have always been present on the spectrum all through, and that really they are just used, these words of oppression, liberation are just used in a way to still keep the group homogeneous and then say you don't belong, you're not within the group. Okay, but that it's a fiction, and that in fact gender fluidity and sexual fluidity has been sort of prevalent throughout society and through history, and that therefore it's a sort of it's a fictional stage that has just created for the purpose of reinforcing the hegemonic group of this sort of Victorian identity or the middle classes as well in France. So it's another example of that. Foucault is quite hard to get into, so you will hear a lot of people talk about Foucault. Some people misunderstand Foucault. It takes a few years to actually get into Foucault and be able to use it appropriately. It's probably one of the toughest sort of postmodern writers out there, and it's one of the ones that doesn't translate well from French to English. So that's sufficient for me today. And if you want to move on and look at the example I give you afterwards, if you do want to go a little bit more into it, you have two texts. So Taylor Medina still has a little section on postmodern thought. Mac doesn't, but you have this instead, Nath. So I got an open access, but it's within a journal, a full journal. So you will have to find it. I think it's on page 36, actually. It says 26. Oh, yes, it is 26, actually. So you have to scroll down and actually find it. It's fairly simple. That's one of the benefits. It's not too complex at this stage for you to be able to, to understand. It kind of gives you, again, a historical and a general understanding of what postmodern thought is. You've also got a website there, which is sort of a blog style, which is going to be useful if you want more information. And here you have another website, which is a full list of all the key authors that have been influential in the postmodern movement. You also have a lot of videos, some better than others, some more simplistic than others, but you have Roland Barthes' Mythologies. So it's called Mythologies, that's how they've translated it. Okay, I think it's myth in French and Mythologies in English. And you've got a video that explains it. Reductionist, but you will get the essence of it. One of the big writers that's been very important in postmodern thought is Judith Butler. Judith Butler was originally a critical theorist, but then moved on to become a postmodern theorist, as many do. Many of the people that you will see working in postmodern thought have started off in critical theory and then sort of slid over. And she has applied postmodern thought to gender, and she's written a very, very important book called Gender Trouble, arguing that, again, the notion of gender, male, female, are social construction, they're cultural representation, and that behind that, the reality is a much more sort of fluid landscape than what this reality that we're offered by discourse. And so she argues for the deconstructions of these words and the recognition of a much more fluid sort of composition in society. So you've got a summary of gender as performance, and then you've got a little summary of her book, Gender Trouble. Applied to disabilities, it has led to this notion of social model of disability, and I think one of your colleagues is going to present on that. And that's a theory on its own right, but it flows from postmodern thought. It's the application of postmodern thought to disability. So you will get a sort of an expose by one of your colleagues on this, but you do have a video there. And if you're interested in that, Colin Barnes in the UK is someone who's written a lot. It's Tom Shakespeare as well. I forgot to write. Tom Shakespeare and Colin Barnes are the two writers who have applied postmodern thought to the notion of disability and impairment. And Judith Butler too has a video on the social model of disability as well that might be useful. So that's applied to gender, with Judith Butler applied to disability. It's applied really to most of the big themes that we're going to encounter in education. So those are easy watching. Explore this at will. This is something you'll probably enjoy doing this afternoon rather than do readings. I think the videos will be quite good to start understanding this sort of deconstructive positioning of postmodern thought. Impact on methodology. I'm going to do this. I'm not even going to open a forum this afternoon, not on that. I'll open a general forum asking you if you have any questions, but I'm not going to lead you into questions because postmodern thought is so complicated. It's really just equipping you with enough knowledge for that fourth compass point. Postmodern, the effect of adopting a postmodern theory on design, it's very straightforward. They don't actually believe in data collection. This is never about the data collection. This deconstruction is much more of an intellectual sort of process, and their data really is society. So it's all cultural representation. So a postmodern process of research is really going to be adopting postmodernism as a theory, and then using all cultural representations around you as data, and then carrying on this sort of intellectual exercise to deconstruct the representations that are given to you of reality through that language. So it's much more of an intellectual process rather than a research process. But for them, that's the essence of the research process. Some examples of postmodernism. I always find that helpful when we're in class face to face. So I'm going to do it now to get you to juggle and understand what a postmodern thought would be on different things that we encounter in education. So one I use often is, what would postmodern think about universities? What do they think about higher education? So a postmodern thinker would start by saying, what are the connotations that come to you when you think about universities? And we could do this face-to-face in class. You would probably say higher learning, and knowledge, education, research, tradition, all these connotations. I probably missed some there. They are going to argue that these, again, are cultural representations that are carried by language and that they're far from the truth. And they're going to encourage you to deconstruct that. And eventually, a postmodern process looking at universities would probably get you to deconstruct all this and say, actually, this is what we're meant to think because of the connotations of language, because of these symbols that language, that these terms carry for us, but that these have been sort of created by the hegemonic groups, so the middle classes, people who've been to university. But in fact, behind that, what you have is the harsh reality of a business model, and that really universities have always been and will always be about creating revenue and justifying their existence through a scrupulous investment. Universities are, before anything else, a business because they make money, and secondly, they are an investment business because they survive and becomes sustainable through careful long-term investment that often has nothing to do with their learning objectives and their research objectives. And postmoderns will argue that that's the hard reality. That's what we need to focus on, and that the symbolism of the words that we carry in these connotations are cultural representations that hide us from seeing the reality. So you see how interesting the process is, because often in your life you will say, "Oh my God, yes, there's definitely something to it. It's definitely something that I can grasp and understand and feel is really relevant." What would postmoderns think about inclusion? Since you are all on the inclusion sort of stream, they would argue again that the very notion of inclusion, a little bit like the gay liberation, is a false word, because inclusion really actually presupposes as another term exclusion, segregation, and that very term meant that we were purporting to say that some people are able-bodied or not able-bodied. So a little bit like the same thing as with the social model, that's a myth, and in fact people have always been on a spectrum of ability, and that we've never had really people who are able or not able, people who are impaired or not impaired. That really behind those cultural representations, in fact, we have a reality that's much more about fluidity, spectrums of ability. So they are going to argue that both the word inclusion and the word that preceded segregations are both fictions that purport to actually make you think that there's a group of people who are separate, who have impairments, who are different than us. In fact, that's never been the case, that we've all been diverse in our learning, and that therefore both the terms are sort of fictions that are offered to us, but that behind that we should really be focusing on, a sort of full spectrum diversity of learners. So it's going to make you really deconstruct most of what you do with inclusion, certainly in diagnosis, but also notions of inclusion, saying, well, you don't need to include people who were never really segregated in terms of reality. They were segregated, again, in terms of creating these fictions, that they should be separate, but that really they were really always on the same spectrum as everyone else in terms of fluidity of learning. What do postmoderns think of school? Well, just like with universities, they will deconstruct the words that would come to mind first, and the cultural representations that would be associated with these words about learning, about all the words that you associate with learning. And postmoderns will probably argue that behind that you actually have a system of control, and that schools have always been about control. They've been much more about allowing parents to go to work and keeping kids in an environment that keeps them fairly submissive and under control during the day while the parents go working. So there's always been very much more of a process of control of population, supervision of population than actual learning. And if you disagree with the postmodern thinkers, think sometimes of some of the things that you see. Why is it so difficult to change starting times in school, for example? Because in fact, the major stakeholder is not the kids or not the learning or not the teachers, it's the parents' ability to go to work. And you've probably seen this in COVID, how real this has become, that really a big facet of the reality of schools is to get kids out of your hands during the day so that you can work. And that's what postmoderns would argue, that the reality is much more about control and management of population than it is about learning itself. So quite harsh, right? Quite harsh, and can sometimes really wreck a moment in the way you reassess the reality that's around you. So I've given you two examples, I think. No, one example. Which relates again to madness, and now you can go back to that article that we had originally about, from University Affairs about mad studies, because obviously postmoderns are going to say this notion of madness is again a construct, it's a cultural reality, a cultural representation, and behind that we have a fluidity of sort of health within a mental sort of mental perspective, and that really there's not such a thing as people who mentally ill, mentally sane, but there's actually a real fluidity there, and that the words that we create are just to help us really feel that we are within a safe little group and we're excluding people, and that's reaffirming our capacity of being in the majority group. But that these are fake notions, right? So it's going to be a lot of work done around postmodern thinking and madness or mental health. For those of you who are interested in can we actually blend theories, and we'll come back to this when we look on Friday morning at working across theoretical divides, or working with colleagues who are maybe in different theories. But I can give you a hint already that I think you have taken a course in critical pedagogy. Well, what is critical pedagogy? Critical pedagogy is actually the blending of critical theory and postmodern thought. How does it do this? Well, it does the whole critiquing thing, in saying that schools. Remember, if you've taken a course, Paulo Freire said schools are really factories, and that really education is a banking model where we drop money passively in this little piggy bank that is the student, and that the teachers really is the line worker in that factory. So really, the whole allegory, that's very postmodern. But it also has element of critical theory in the sense that critical pedagogy works in action. It's about transforming schools so that they're no longer there. So you've got that critical theory element of emancipation, and so transforming the world. So it's that whole critique of the schools and that whole critical theory aspect of changing the schools in a political way by re-empowering people. So it manages to do both. You will see the critical theory and postmodern thought is sometimes very, very easy to align, sometimes not. This is an example where they're easy to align. On Friday morning, I'll show you examples where sometimes there's a big clash and they don't always seem eye to eye. And also, this is really quite advanced, but if you're interested in autoethnography, so it's the process of, as a methodology of working on yourself, on your own discourse, and working in terms of political awakeness within that sort of self reflection on your own thoughts and your own journaling. There's been good examples there of critical theory and postmodern thoughts merging in that time too, because obviously that reflection, that act of writing and on self and examining your own writing enables you to deconstruct your assumptions in a very postmodern way, and then to direct your action towards transformative action in a very critical theory way. So you're going to see in that within that writing a lot of combining of both. But again, this is really advanced, so don't go too much into it if you're not specifically looking at that. It's no need to cloud the issue. I think up to this point, everything is very clear. And that's it. We're finished for this unit. So I will post that. And any time that you have remaining, and then you should dedicate to your presentations for Thursday and Friday because we're getting closer. So this was really just an introduction, but I hope it's given you enough of an introduction to be able to walk that ground in a confident way and to come back to postmodern thinking later on in life whenever you are interested in exploring it further, because it is very relevant. And on Friday, we will see in some examples how critical theory and postmodern thought are all around you in very practical ways in some of the debates in 2020 that we see around us in political debate, particularly. So I'll stop for now, and I will see you on this afternoon for philosophical approaches to theory, so philosophical theories, and also cognitive theories. I'm going to give you an example of both, and also define them as categories in case these are useful when you get to your own presentation.